She didn't even look back. That was the part that cut deepest. Not the words she said. Not the way she pushed her chair back from the table so hard it scraped against the floor. Not the silence that followed, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on every person in that cafe who had just witnessed a woman walk out on a man in a wheelchair like he was furniture she'd grown tired of. She didn't look back. Kang Min-jae sat alone at the corner table of Cafe Sora, his untouched espresso going cold in front of him, and he did not move. Not because he couldn't, because he had spent 11 years perfecting the art of stillness when everything inside him was coming apart. The woman's name was Seo Yuna. She was 34, beautiful in the calculated way of someone who had studied beauty like a discipline, and she had spent 40 minutes at that table telling him, in increasingly polished language, that she simply could not see herself building a future with someone who required so much accommodation. That was the word she used, accommodation, like he was a hotel request, like the wheelchair was an inconvenience she'd booked by accident and was now trying to get refunded. He hadn't argued. He never argued in public. That was the first rule. But his left hand, the one she couldn't see from her side of the table, had pressed flat against his thigh, hard enough to leave a mark. Now she was gone, and the cafe had returned to its quiet nighttime sounds. Rain against glass, the hiss of the espresso machine, jazz from speakers mounted too high on the wall. And Min-jae sat in the wreckage of another evening and breathed slowly through his nose. The man at the table nearest to him pretended to look at his phone. The couple by the window pretended to talk to each other. The barista behind the counter, a young man with a small silver earring, had gone very focused on wiping down the same section of counter for the past 3 minutes. Everyone had seen. No one would say anything. That was New York. That was also what money did. Kang Min-jae's money, specifically. The kind that made people look away and find sudden interest in other things. He reached forward and picked up the espresso cup. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Outside, rain came down in sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cafe Sora. The streets were nearly empty. It was past 9 on a Tuesday, and even Manhattan had its quiet hours, the ones that fell between the theater crowds going home and the late-night crowd deciding where to go next. A garbage truck groaned around a corner somewhere. A taxi horn punched through the rain and died. Min-jae set down the cup. His phone sat face up on the table. No messages. His men would have seen the car leave, Yuna's driver, not his. And they would know. They always knew. But none of them would say anything either. That was the other rule, the one nobody had to be told twice. He was 37 years old, and he had not spent a comfortable evening in what felt like a very long time. The cafe door opened. The sound of the rain swelled for a moment and then was cut off as the door swung shut behind the woman who had just come in. She was shaking water off a jacket that had clearly lost the argument against the storm. Dark canvas, probably once waterproof, now just wet. Her hair was pulled back, but half of it had escaped, plastered to the side of her face. She had a bag over one shoulder, large and overstuffed, the kind people carry when they're living more of their life outside than in. She was breathing a little hard, like she'd been running. She stood just inside the door for a moment, dripping, looking around the cafe with the cautious speed of someone who needs to assess a room quickly and has had reason to learn how to do it. Her eyes moved across the space without hesitating on anything too long. The couple by the window, the man with the phone, the barista, the corner table. For exactly 1 second, her gaze landed on Min-jae. Then she moved toward the counter. He watched her without appearing to watch her. It was a skill he had refined over 2 decades in environments where being caught watching something could end your evening in a permanent way. He kept his face arranged in its usual expression, which was to say, arranged in almost no expression at all, and tracked her in his peripheral vision as she reached the counter and asked for something. The barista said something back. She opened her bag and went through it and came up with a wallet that was held together by what appeared to be a rubber band. She counted something out carefully, put some of it back. Counted again. The barista waited with the particular patience of someone who either had a good nature or was well trained. Probably both, in this place. She ordered something small. Coffee, black, based on the way the barista reached for the pot instead of starting the machine. She took it to a table in the middle of the room, not near the windows, not in a corner, and sat down, pushing her wet jacket to the back of the chair, and pulled a laptop from the bag. It was old enough that the startup sound was audible from across the room. She winced at the sound and shot a quick, apologetic look around the cafe. Nobody looked up, or nobody appeared to. Min-jae looked at his empty espresso cup. Then he looked at her. She was focused on whatever was on her screen now, leaning slightly forward, jaw set, the coffee cooling next to her elbow, the same way his had cooled. There was something about the way she sat, not tense exactly, but contained, like someone who was used to taking up only the space they needed and not an inch more. She had a scar on her left wrist. He couldn't see it clearly from here. A glimpse, nothing more, as she'd pushed her sleeve back before opening the laptop. A line of raised skin, old enough to have faded, but not old enough to have disappeared. Min-jae's stillness changed quality. From the practiced stillness of a man controlling his reaction to the stillness of a man who had just noticed something that required a different kind of attention entirely. He looked away from her. His phone was face up on the table. He picked it up and typed a short message with his thumb. Sent it. Set the phone back down. Across the cafe, the woman reached for her coffee without looking away from her screen, took a sip, made a small expression that suggested the coffee was not good, but she was going to drink it anyway. Min-jae almost smiled. He didn't. His phone lit up. He read the response, typed another message, and set it back down. Then he straightened slightly in the wheelchair, not dramatically, just the adjustment of a man deciding something, and spoke. The coffee here is terrible, his voice carried without being raised. That was something else he'd practiced, though it had come more naturally than most things. The woman looked up from her laptop. She looked at him the way people look at someone who has addressed them unexpectedly, that quick recalibration, deciding whether this was a social situation or a threat situation or just an inconvenience. She appeared to decide it was none of the above. I noticed, she said. They're better at the pastries, if you haven't eaten. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she looked back at her screen. I'm fine. I'm not trying to bother you. I know. She typed something, but I'm fine. Min-jae accepted this without expression. He had been rejected more gracefully and less gracefully than that in the past hour alone, and this at least had the quality of honesty. She wasn't fine. The rubber-banded wallet and the single black coffee and the old laptop with the startup sound all said so clearly enough. But she didn't want his interference, and he found strangely that he respected that more than he would have respected a polite acceptance. He looked back toward the window. The rain was still coming down. His car was parked half a block away, Dong-hyun behind the wheel, engine running. He could leave. There was nothing keeping him here except the fact that he had nowhere particularly pressing to go, and the penthouse waiting for him felt, tonight, like an empty place he had agreed to inhabit without much enthusiasm. He stayed. The cafe settled into its quiet sounds again. Jazz, rain, the barista moving around behind the counter, restocking something. The couple by the window was getting ready to leave. Coats, phone checks, the small choreography of two people ending an evening together. The woman with the laptop ordered nothing else. She worked, or whatever she was doing. He couldn't see her screen from here, but her expression was the expression of someone reading something difficult and thinking hard about it. She made notes in a small notebook beside the laptop. Physical notes, handwritten, which was either an old habit or a deliberate choice. He suspected the latter. 40 minutes passed. Min-jae was considering leaving when her phone rang. She snatched it up fast, the reflex of someone who keeps their phone on silent and had forgotten to, or whose phone ringing in a quiet place was more alarming than inconvenient. She looked at the screen. Her face changed, not dramatically, just around the eyes. A tightening that lasted less than a second before she controlled it. She stood, pressing the phone to her ear, and moved toward the back of the cafe where the restrooms were, putting distance between herself and the other tables. Min-jae heard 3 words before she turned the corner out of sight. How bad is it? Not a question. The tone was the tone of someone who already knew the answer was going to be bad and was bracing for the specific variety. He listened to the rain for a moment. Then his phone lit up again, and this time when he read the message, his stillness changed quality for the second time in an hour, and it was not a small change. The message was from a man named Park Seong-won, who was one of 7 people in the city whose messages Min-jae read within 30 seconds of receipt. It contained a name, a location, this cafe, this address, and a photograph. The photograph was of the woman with the laptop. Beneath the photograph, Seong-won had written 4 words. She has been watching. Min-jae set the phone face down on the table. He looked at the hallway where she had disappeared. He thought about the scar on her wrist. He thought about a burning building in the Bronx 8 years ago, and a girl 18 years old with her hands torn open, and a choice he had made in the smoke and the dark that he had never told anyone about. Not one person in 11 years of keeping secrets for a living. He thought about what it meant that she was here, in this cafe, on this night. She came back around the corner. Her face was composed again. The tightening around the eyes was gone, replaced by something flatter and more deliberate. She was good at it. Better than most people. Not as good as him, but he had a significant head start. She sat back down, opened her laptop, stared at the screen for a moment without typing anything. Then she closed the laptop. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her coffee going cold and her jaw working slightly, the way a person's jaw works when they are deciding something difficult, and the deciding is happening in real time. Min-jae watched her make her decision from across the room. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, physical, paper, rubber-banded like her wallet, worn at the corners from what looked like months of handling. She opened it, and even from here he could see the papers inside were dense with text and photographs and handwritten annotations in the margins. She stared at the top page. Then she looked up, and she looked directly at him. And this time it was not the look of a woman glancing at a stranger who had spoken to her. This time it was something else entirely. Measured, deliberate, with a quality underneath it that he recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror for most of his adult life. She was furious. She was furious in the deep, cold, settled way of someone who has been furious for a very long time about something that cannot be fixed quickly, and has learned to carry that fury like a stone in a pocket, always there, always weighted, never shown to anyone unless the moment demanded it. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. He looked back. Then she put the folder away, closed her bag, and stood up. She walked to his table. She stopped. Standing over him with her damp jacket and her rubber-banded wallet and her 8-year obsession arranged in a folder she had probably read so many times she could recite it backward, and she said nothing for a moment. He waited. "You're Kang Min-jae," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes," he said. "My name is Amara Whitfield." She said it like she was presenting evidence. "My mother is Elena Whitfield. My sister was Jade Whitfield. 8 years ago, your people destroyed the building my family was in. Jade died in that fire. My mother disappeared the same night." She said all of this without her voice shaking, which he knew cost her something, because her left hand had come to rest against the side of her bag, and her knuckles were white against the canvas. "I've been looking for answers for 8 years. Every lead I followed brought me to you." Min-jae looked at her hand, at the scar on her wrist. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I'm not here to sit down with you." "I know." He held her gaze. "Sit down anyway." Something crossed her face, not quite uncertainty, but a recalibration of the kind she'd made at the door, assessing whether this was a threat situation or something else. She pulled out the chair that Yuna had pushed back so hard an hour ago and sat in it. Her spine was straight. Her hands went flat on the table between them. "You know who I am," she said. "I know who you are." "You knew before I walked over." He didn't answer that. She read the non-answer correctly. Her jaw tightened. "How long have you known I was investigating you?" "Long enough." He reached for his phone and turned it face up on the table between them, and he watched her see the photograph, her own face looking back at her, and the message beneath it, and he watched her process what that meant without looking away from her to give her privacy she probably didn't want anyway. Her expression didn't break. He was starting to think it didn't break easily. "So you knew I was here," she said. "Tonight." "No. Tonight was coincidence." She looked at him like she did not believe in coincidences. "I understand that," he said. "I don't either, normally." He picked up the photograph, looked at it for a moment, set it back down. "But some things happen without engineering." "Is that what you call what your people did 8 years ago? Without engineering?" The question hit with a quieter force than shouting would have. He took it. "No," he said. "That was engineered, by someone I trusted." He looked at the rain on the window. "And by my own failures before that." Amara stared at him. Whatever she had prepared herself to face in this man, fury, denial, the cold management of a crime lord handling a threat, this was not it. She had prepared for a wall. He was not being a wall. That made him more dangerous, not less. She knew that. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want to give you something you came here looking for." Files. Access. Which is different. Files can be falsified. Access gives you the ability to verify. He met her eyes. "I want you to work for me. 6 weeks. I have a problem inside my organization that requires someone with your skill set. Someone who doesn't already exist inside the structure, who can move through it without existing relationships affecting their observations. You want me to be a spy. I want you to be an investigator, which is what you already are. Inside the organization that killed my sister." The words landed between them. Neither of them moved. "Inside the organization," he said carefully, "that was used to kill your sister by someone who lied to me about what the target was." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to understand that the story you've been investigating for 8 years has a middle section that you haven't found yet." Amara looked at the folder in her bag. He could see her thinking. He could almost see the structure of it, the way she was laying this against everything she already knew and measuring the gaps. "And if I say no," she said. "You walk out of here," he said. "I don't stop you. I don't follow you. I don't have anyone follow you." He paused. "And you spend whatever time you have left on this investigation without access to the parts that are locked. You'd let me walk away. I'd let you walk away." She studied him. "Why?" she said. He looked at the scar on her wrist. He did not look away quickly. "Because I owe you that," he said. "At minimum." Amara's hand moved slightly, almost involuntarily, pulling her sleeve down over the scar. It was the first uncontrolled movement she'd made since sitting down. She stopped it, left her sleeve where it was. She looked at him for a long time. The rain came down outside. The jazz played from the speakers mounted too high on the wall. The barista started wiping down the counter again, giving them the room, giving them the particular privacy that good service people know how to provide without being asked. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. I want written access. Real files, not summaries. Real access to financial records, communications, operational histories. Agreed. If at any point I feel I'm being managed or misled, you leave, immediately. No consequences. I'll have someone on the outside. They know where I am and who I'm with. If I stop checking in, understood. She sat back slightly. Her hands were still flat on the table, but her knuckles were no longer white. I came here tonight to find a way into your world, she said. I didn't expect it to open. Doors don't usually open from the outside, he said. That's what makes them doors. She looked at him with something that was not quite the fury anymore, something harder to name. I haven't decided yet, she said, whether you're the worst thing that ever happened to me or something else. He picked up his empty espresso cup and set it down on the other side of the table, away from him, a small gesture of clearing space. That's all right, he said. I haven't decided that about myself either. Outside, the rain kept falling. The city moved around them with its usual indifference to the things happening in its quieter corners. And across a table in a cafe that served bad coffee and excellent pastries, two people who had arrived at this moment by completely different roads sat in the wreckage of their separate losses and tried to figure out what came next. Neither of them had any idea how much worse it was going to get before it got anywhere near better. But Amara Whitfield reached into her bag, opened her rubber-banded folder, and put the top page face down on the table between them. Start there, she said. Tell me what I got wrong. And Kang Min-jae, who had not told anyone the truth about that night in 8 years, looked at the page and began. Min-jae looked at the page for a long time. It was a financial record, partial, clearly copied from something larger, with handwritten annotations in the margins in 2 different colors of ink. Blue for what Amara had verified, red for what she hadn't. She had drawn lines between entries, connecting numbers to names to dates in a web that was messy and dense, and he could see immediately, pointed in roughly the right direction for mostly the wrong reasons. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Amara watched him read. She had learned, over 8 years of doing this kind of work, that the most informative thing a person does when confronted with evidence is not what they say. It's what they do with their face when they think no one is paying close enough attention. She was always paying close enough attention. He wasn't surprised by the document. That was the first thing she clocked. No micro-expression of recognition, no sharp intake of breath. None of the tells that come when a person sees something they know and didn't expect you to have. He was reading it the way you read something you're encountering for the first time. But his stillness had a quality she couldn't quite name, a density to it, like a man standing in a room where something is about to fall and deciding whether to move. "Where did you get this?" he said. "A contact inside a financial auditing firm. It took me 14 months to cultivate him." "He gave you a fragment." "I know. He gave you the fragment that points to a dummy account in the Cayman structure. There are 6 others." He set the page down. "The dummy account is real. What moves through it is real. But whoever you think it belongs to, it doesn't." Amara felt the shift in her chest that happened every time a piece of her architecture turned out to be load-bearing in the wrong direction. She kept her face even. "Then whose is it?" "I'll show you." He picked up his phone. "But not tonight. Tonight you and I are going to establish what you already know and what you only think you know, because the gap between those two things is where people get killed." It was the casual delivery of the last 3 words that made her stomach tighten. Not a threat. A statement of operational fact from someone who had watched it happen. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he repeated, with a flatness that might have contained something wry underneath it if she'd been inclined to look. She wasn't inclined to look. Not yet. They spent the next 2 hours at that table, the bad coffee replaced twice by the barista who had clearly decided tonight was worth staying late for. Amara laid out what she had, piece by piece, and Min Jae listened more than he spoke, which was not what she'd expected. When he did speak, it was specific. A date corrected by 4 days. A name she'd been using that turned out to be a code name for a position, not a person. A transaction she'd flagged as suspicious. That was, he explained without inflection, a legitimate payment to a legitimate contractor who happened to structure their invoices in a way that looked like laundering to someone who didn't know the contractor. He was precise. He was also, she noticed, careful about what he gave her. He answered what she asked. He didn't volunteer beyond it. That was fine. So did she. By the time the barista finally said, with genuine apology, that he needed to close, Amara had covered the table in papers, and Min Jae had moved his wheelchair 3 inches forward at some point in the last hour, without her noticing when, and they were closer than they'd started, and neither of them had commented on it. She packed her folder. He watched her do it. "Tomorrow," he said. 9 o'clock. I'll have someone meet you. I'll find my own way. The building isn't findable without assistance." She looked at him. "For security reasons," he said. "Not control ones." "Is there a difference in your world?" He considered this with what appeared to be genuine thought. "Less than there should be," he said. She almost said something to that. Didn't. Put her bag over her shoulder and stood. "I'll be there at 9, she said. He nodded once. She walked out without looking back. He sat alone at the corner table until the barista finished locking up, and then Dong-hyun appeared at the door with an umbrella and an expression of absolute professional neutrality, and Min Jae let himself be helped into the car without speaking, which Dong-hyun understood to mean the drive home would be a quiet one. It was a quiet one. The first morning inside Min Jae's operation was an education in how power actually moved when it didn't want to be seen moving. The building was in Midtown, which was either very bold or very ordinary, depending on how you thought about it, hiding in plain sight behind a corporate facade that listed 3 separate consulting firms on its directory board, none of which, Amara would later confirm, had ever consulted on anything. The man who met her in the lobby was introduced as Ryu Changmin, late 20s, built like someone who took his physical fitness seriously and his facial expressions seriously in the opposite direction. He said good morning, handed her a badge, and walked her to an elevator without offering further conversation. She decided she liked him provisionally. Direct people were easier to read. The 14th floor was where it actually lived. Open plan, expensive equipment, the kind of organized functionality that came from having enough money to buy good systems and enough discipline to actually use them. 8 people at workstations when she arrived at 3 minutes past 9. All of them looked up. None of them held the look. Min Jae was already there, at a table near the windows, with a man Amara did not know standing beside him. The man was in his mid-40s, lean in the way of someone who had been lean their whole life without effort, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of composed, warm expression that immediately put Amara on guard. Warmth in rooms like this was either genuine, which made it rare, or practiced, which made it a tool. "Amara Whitfield," Min Jae said. "This is Jun Tae-hyun." June extended a hand. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. "I've heard good things," he said. His English was excellent, better than excellent, nearly unaccented, with the particular fluency of someone who'd spent significant time in English-speaking environments. "Min-jae says you have an unusual background." "Investigative research," Amara said. "Mostly financial forensics." "Impressive." He smiled. It reached his eyes. "We can use that. We've had some irregular accounting patterns in one of the outer operations that's been frustrating our internal team. I'll take a look." "Wonderful." He patted the table once, lightly, like he was closing a meeting that had already gone well. "Settle in. Ask Changmin if you need anything. He's unpleasant, but competent." He walked away toward another cluster of workstations. Amara watched him go and then looked at Min-jae, who was already looking at her. His expression said nothing. That was its own message. She sat down. Changmin set a laptop in front of her. Clean, new, already configured. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Is it monitored?" she asked. He blinked. "The building network is logged. Standard. My work product stays mine until I share it. That'd be above my authorization level. Then let's get it authorized." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that recalibrated slightly, moving from polite professionalism to something more attentive. And then he went to make a call. Min-jae watched this from across the room without appearing to. She got the authorization by 10 o'clock. The next 3 days were a specific kind of exhausting that Amara had learned to recognize over years of doing this kind of work. Not physically. She could handle physical. Cognitively and interpersonally exhausting. The kind that came from maintaining two complete versions of yourself simultaneously. The version that existed for the room and the version that was actually doing the work underneath it. The version for the room was competent and cooperative and slightly less sharp than she actually was, because being visibly smarter than the people around you in a place like this was a faster way to become a problem than she could currently afford. The version underneath was cataloging everything. Jun Tae-hyun was, on the surface, exactly what he presented. Experienced, organized, respected by the team, in the specific way people respect someone who is effective and fair and doesn't make their lives difficult. He ran the operation's daily structure with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough that the efficiency was second nature. He knew everyone's name. He asked about things they'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier. He was the kind of person who made people feel seen, which was either his genuine nature or his most effective tool, and after 3 days, Amara was leaning toward the latter. It was the small things. The way he moved through conversations, always the listener, drawing other people out, offering very little in return. The way he physically positioned himself, always with the room in his sightline, always knowing where the exits were. The way his composed warmth remained perfectly consistent regardless of what was happening around it, which was the tell. Genuine warmth fluctuated. Genuine warmth responded to the temperature of a room. His didn't. She put nothing in writing yet. She needed more time. On the 4th day, she made a mistake. It was a small mistake. The kind that only becomes visible in retrospect, which is the worst kind, because there's no warning signal you could have heeded. She was reviewing a communications log that Changmin had cleared her to access, and she followed a reference to a secondary account ledger, and the reference led somewhere it wasn't supposed to lead. And instead of backing out when she hit the edge of her authorized access, she went 2 steps further before she caught herself. 2 steps. Less than 30 seconds. She closed the ledger, cleared her cache, and went back to what she was supposed to be looking at, and her face was completely neutral, and nobody in the room reacted, and she thought, for about 4 hours, that it had been nothing. Then Changmin appeared at her workstation at 5 in the afternoon and said, "Min-jae wants to see you." The office Min-jae used on this floor was smaller than she'd expected. A desk, a window, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf with the kind of books on it that suggested they were actually read. He was at the desk when she came in. Changmin closed the door behind her without coming in himself. "Sit," Min-jae said. She sat. "Tell me what you were looking for in the secondary ledger." She kept her face even. "I followed a reference. It led somewhere I wasn't authorized. I backed out." "You went 2 steps past the authorized boundary. I've told you what happened." "I know what happened. I'm asking you why." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them were performing anything right now. They were both just sitting in the room with the facts of the situation. The reference led to a transaction code I'd seen before, she said. In my own research. Before I came here. Something shifted in the air between them. Which code? He said. She said it. 14 characters, a format she'd memorized because it had appeared 3 times in 3 separate documents across 2 different investigations, and she had never been able to trace where it originated. Min-jae's left hand pressed flat against the desk. She watched his hand. You've seen that code before, he said. It wasn't a question. 3 times, different contexts. I've never been able to source it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved in its afternoon patterns, traffic thickening, the light shifting toward early evening. That code, he said, belongs to a financial routing structure that was set up 8 years ago. Specifically, he paused. In the 6 weeks before the operation that burned your family's building. The room got very still. Amara's breathing did not change. She had trained herself for years to control her breathing in moments like this, because breathing was the thing people couldn't hide, and she could not afford to not hide it right now. Who built the routing structure, she said. That, Min-jae said carefully, is what I need you to help me find out. You don't know? I have a strong suspicion. His voice was measured. I need evidence. She looked at him, at his hand flat on the desk, at the particular quality of his stillness, which she was starting to read more clearly now. The stillness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was standing very carefully because he knew if he moved too fast, the weight would shift wrong. June, she said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He held her gaze and said nothing, and his silence had the shape of a yes. Her mind moved fast, faster than she let her face show. 8 years of architecture, the financial records, the names, the dates, the transaction codes, the photograph of a building burning and a little girl inside it. All of it shifted 3 degrees, and the picture it made was different, not completely different, but the center of it had moved, and the center was the piece that determined what everything else meant. How long have you suspected him? She said. 18 months. And you brought me in because everyone inside this organization has an existing relationship with June, Min-jae said. An existing history. Loyalties that predate the suspicion. I needed someone clean. He paused. Someone with enough of their own reason to be thorough. The anger that moved through her was clean and cold. Not at him, not exactly, but at the situation, at the years, at the fact that she had come here as the person investigating and was apparently also being used as a tool in someone else's investigation. She let herself feel it for exactly the time it took to breathe in and out once, and then she put it somewhere she could come back to later. You used me, she said. I offered you a deal that is mutually beneficial. That's a careful way to say yes. Yes, he said. I used you. I also gave you access to things you couldn't have gotten any other way. Both are true. She stood up. He didn't tell her to sit back down, which she noted. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the city in the early evening light. And she breathed, and she thought. If June had built the routing structure, then June had controlled the financial architecture that funded the operation, which meant June had known what the target actually was, which meant the false intelligence hadn't been an error. It had been deliberate construction. Someone with access to Min-jae's intelligence pipeline had built a false picture of the target and run it up through channels that Min-jae had trusted. She turned around. I need access to the communications archive, she said, 18 months back. Changmin will set it up. Not Changmin directly. I access it myself. He studied her. Agreed. And I need to know something. She came back to the desk and stood over him, not aggressively but deliberately, because she needed to see his face when she asked this. The night after the operation, the building, you were there. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. She'd seen enough guilt to recognize it, and this wasn't that. Something more complicated. The look of a man arriving at a door he knew was on the other side of a conversation and had been walking toward it for 8 years. Yes, he said. You saw me. Yes. Her throat tightened. She had promised herself she would not let this be emotional. She had promised herself that this was investigative, procedural, that she was here for information and justice and truth, and not for the feeling of standing in front of the man connected to the worst night of her life and demanding answers. She had not entirely kept that promise. Then you know that I was trying to reach my sister, she said. Her voice was even, steady. She was proud of it, and she hated that she needed to be proud of it. And you know that I couldn't. Yes. And you pulled me out. The silence had weight. Yes, he said. Why? He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because you were 18 years old, and you were trying to save your sister, and I had already done enough damage that night. The words landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for. She had expected justification, calculation, the explanation of a man who had made a tactical decision in a crisis. The grief in his voice, quiet, old, the kind that had been lived with so long it had become simply part of how he spoke, was not something she had prepared for, and she did not know what to do with it immediately. She did not let that show. I'm going to find the evidence, she said, whatever it takes. And when I do, June answers for what he did. Not just to you, to my family. Yes, Min-jae said. If you interfere with that, if at any point the protection of your organization takes precedence over the truth, it won't. You say that now. I know what I'm saying. His voice was quiet and absolute. I have been living with the truth of that night for 8 years. I don't need it protected. I need it finished. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the door. Good night, she said. Good night. She left. In the elevator going down, alone, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly the duration of 3 floors. And in those 3 floors, she let herself feel everything she had been holding back for the last 2 hours. The fury, the grief, the exhausted disorientation of having her hatred for this man, complicated by the fact that he had saved her life, complicated by the fact that he was, apparently, as much a victim of that night as she was, complicated by the fact that none of this made the outcome any different. Jade was still dead, and her mother was still gone, and she was still a woman who had spent 8 years building a case in the quiet hours of her life because there was nothing else she could do with the size of the loss. 4th floor. She opened her eyes, straightened her jacket. The lobby was nearly empty when she walked through it. Outside, the city was doing what the city did in the evening, pressing forward, indifferent, enormous, full of people who had their own weights in their own pockets and were carrying them in their own directions. She walked 2 blocks north before she stopped at a doorway and took out her phone. She called a number from memory. It rang 4 times. Check in, she said when it picked up. I'm in. It's what we thought, and it's also not what we thought. I'll explain in person. She paused. Don't move on anything yet. I need more time. She hung up. She stood in the doorway with the city moving past her and the evening air cold against the back of her neck. And she thought about a transaction code she'd seen 3 times in 3 separate documents across 2 different investigations. She thought about what it meant that the code appeared in Min-jae's secondary ledger. She thought about this fact that she had not told Min-jae that the 3rd time she'd seen the code, it had appeared in a document that was connected not to Min-jae's organization. It was connected to her mother. And somewhere in the 14-story building behind her, Jun Tae-hyun sat at his workstation in the warm glow of the office he had managed for years. And he smiled at something on his screen, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman Min-jae had just brought into his world was the same girl who had survived a burning building 8 years ago. Or at least, that was what Amara needed him to believe. Because the thing she had not yet told Min-jae, the piece she was holding close, the card she had not laid on any table, was that she had been inside Jun Tae-hyun's world before. Not this world. A smaller one, years earlier, a name in a document, a connection she had traced and lost and traced again, a thread that led somewhere she hadn't been able to follow yet. She had not told Min-jae because she was not yet sure what it meant. And in this kind of work, moving on something you didn't fully understand yet was how people ended up in burning buildings. She knew that better than anyone. She found the connection on a Thursday at 2:17 in the morning in the communications archive that Min-jae had given her direct access to 3 days earlier. She had been working backward from the transaction code, her transaction code, the 14-character sequence that had appeared in her own research 3 times before she ever walked into Cafe Sora. The archive was dense, years of encrypted communications that Changmin's team had partially decrypted and indexed, and she had been moving through it with the systematic patience of someone who had learned that the thing you were looking for was almost never where you expected it, but it was always somewhere, Because people who did terrible things still had to coordinate them, still had to leave some record of the coordination, still had to trust someone enough to put something in writing. The document she found was not dramatic. It never was. It was a routing confirmation, a single page, time-stamped 6 weeks before the night of the fire, showing a financial transfer between two accounts through the 14-character code as the authorization key. The originating account she recognized. It was one of June's outer accounts, the one she had been building her case around for the past week. The receiving account she did not recognize. She ran it, cross-referenced it, against everything in the archive, against her own records, against 3 separate financial databases she had access to through channels Min-jae didn't know about. It took 40 minutes. The receiving account had been closed 8 years ago, 4 days after the fire, dissolved through a legal structure that was thorough enough to have taken real resources to construct. But the name on the dissolution filing was still there. She stared at it. She read it 3 times, the way you read something when your brain is refusing to process it correctly, insisting there must be a different arrangement of the letters that makes a different meaning. The name on the dissolution filing was Amara Whitfield, her mother. Amara sat back in her chair and did not move for a long time. The room around her was empty. She had been working alone in the archive space for hours, the building quiet. The way buildings got at 2 in the morning, a skeleton crew somewhere in the floors below, and nothing else. The city outside the windows was doing its nighttime thing, reduced to its essential sounds, and she was sitting in a chair staring at her mother's name on a document that connected Amara Whitfield directly to the financial structure that had funded the operation that burned their building and killed Jade. She thought, very clearly and very carefully, about the possibility that this was a frame, that someone had put her mother's name on that document deliberately, to misdirect, to muddy, to create exactly the kind of paralysis she was currently experiencing. She thought about it for 4 minutes by the clock on her screen. Then she thought about the 3rd time she'd seen the transaction code in her own research, the document it had appeared in, the connection she had traced and lost and traced again, the thread she had not been able to follow. She had not been able to follow it because every time she got close to the source, the trail ended at the same place, a point of contact between her mother and a criminal organization 8 years ago. She had told herself for years that her mother had been a victim, that Amara Whitfield had been collateral damage in something she had no part in, someone who'd been in the wrong building at the wrong time, who had then disappeared because the people responsible had either taken her or frightened her into hiding. Amara had built 8 years of her life around that story. She stood up. Her legs were steady, which surprised her. She walked to the window and looked at the city and breathed in the specific way she'd taught herself to breathe when something was trying to pull her apart. Slowly, through the nose, 4 counts, hold, release. She did it twice. Then she went back to the screen and kept working, because the other possibility, the one she was not going to collapse around, not tonight, not without more, was that her mother had known something, had been involved in something, had made a choice, or been coerced into making a choice that had put her name on a document that connected her to June Tae-yoon's money. And if that was true, then Amara had spent 8 years pointing her investigation at the wrong person. Not entirely wrong. June was still there, in the architecture. His fingerprints were still on the false intelligence, the manipulated operation, the transaction code. But the picture was larger than she had allowed herself to see. She worked until 5 in the morning. By the time she stopped, she had 3 things she hadn't had before. The routing document with her mother's name. A secondary communication buried deep in the archive between an unidentified account and June, dated 2 weeks before the fire, referencing the asset in language that was deliberately vague but structurally consistent with a human informant. And a photograph, embedded in the communication as an attachment, low resolution, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge, of a woman entering a building that Amara recognized. The building was in the Bronx, the building that had burned. The woman in the photograph was her mother. The photograph was dated 5 days before the fire. Amara closed the laptop. She sat in the dark archive room with her hands in her lap and her eyes open and her breathing under control by the thinnest possible margin. And she thought about her mother's face, and she thought about Jade, and she thought about 8 years of a story that had been, apparently, more complicated than she had been able to bear to see. She was still sitting there when Min-jae arrived at 7:15. She heard the elevator, heard the specific sound of the wheelchair in the hallway, and by the time he opened the door, she was standing, the laptop closed, her face arranged. He looked at her. He knew immediately that something had happened. She could see him know it. The slight change in how he held himself, the quality of attention sharpening. "When did you last sleep?" he said. "I need to show you something." "Amara, Now," she said. "Please." He came into the room. She opened the laptop and pulled up the routing document and turned the screen toward him without saying anything else. He read it. He read it the way she had. The first pass, the second pass, the third one where you were still trying to find the different arrangement of letters. Then he was still. "You found this in my archive," he said. "Yes." "This account." He pointed at the receiving end. "The dissolution filing." "Elena Whitfield. My mother." She kept her voice flat. "I know." He looked at her. The warmth he usually maintained in his expression, not warmth she'd decided, more like careful attention, was gone. What was underneath was older and tireder and more honest. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I'm not accusing you." "I want to be clear." "I said I'm not accusing you." She took the laptop back. "But I need you to tell me everything you know about how June recruited informants, the process, the structure, who he used, how he approached them, what he offered." Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." "I don't need to sit down. Please sit down." She sat. He moved the wheelchair closer to the table, and they were sitting across from each other in the early morning light the same way they had sat in the cafe, except the papers between them now were worse. June's recruitment model, Min-jae said slowly, was built around vulnerability. He identified people who were already inside situations they couldn't control: financial pressure, family threats, existing entanglements with criminal structures they hadn't chosen. He approached them as a resource, an offer of protection or resolution in exchange for access. Amara listened with her hands flat on the table. He preferred people who had something to lose, Min-jae continued, because people with something to lose could be managed. They didn't want to be informants. They wanted their problem to go away. That dynamic gave him control. "My mother," Amara said, "had a debt. I found it in her financial records years ago. I couldn't source it. Large, accrued over 2 years before the fire, to an entity that didn't trace back to anything real. The entity would have been one of June's holding structures. He put her in debt to himself. Or he acquired an existing debt, bought it from whoever she originally owed." Min-jae's voice was careful. "That was another method, cleaner. The person never knew their debt had been purchased. They simply started receiving different contact instructions." Amara looked at the window. "She didn't choose this," she said. "It came out quieter than she intended." "Probably not." "She was being managed." "Almost certainly. And when the operation happened, when your people came to that building, she would have had no control over that." He paused. "Whatever information she provided because she believed it was the only way to protect herself, or you, or your sister." He stopped. "I'm speculating." "I know. I could be wrong." "I know." She pressed both hands flat against the table and looked at him. "But you're not wrong." They sat with that for a moment. Then something else moved in Amara's chest, something she recognized as the beginning of a question she had been not asking herself for a week, and she was done not asking it. "The night of the fire," she said. "You were there. You pulled me out." She held his gaze. "Were you looking for me? Or were you looking for her?" Min-jae said nothing. "Min-jae?" "I was there," he said carefully, "because I had been told the intelligence was wrong 20 minutes before the operation executed. Not wrong enough to stop it. There was a real threat in that building, or June had constructed enough of a real threat that I couldn't abort. But wrong in the specifics." His jaw was tight. "I went to the scene. I needed to see." "You needed to see what you'd done." "Yes." "And you found me." "I found you," she breathed. "And my mother?" The silence this time was longer. It had a different texture, not the silence of a man choosing his words, but the silence of a man who had arrived at a door he had been walking toward for a very long time and found it heavier than he'd expected. "Your mother," he said, "was not in the building when I arrived." Amara went very still. "She had been there," he said, "earlier. But when the operation executed, she wasn't inside." She got out. She was removed. He met her eyes. By June, before it started, the room tilted slightly. Not physically. The room did not move. But the 8-year architecture of Amara's understanding of what had happened that night torqued in a way that made everything she was looking at rearrange itself with sickening speed. He protected her, Amara said. He removed his asset, while leaving me and Jade inside. You were not his concern. His voice was flat, stating fact, and she could hear that he hated the fact he was stating. You and your sister were not part of his operational calculation. She stood up. The chair moved back hard. She walked to the window and stood there, and her hands were shaking, which she had not allowed to happen once in this building in a week, and she could not stop it. Jade had been 17. She had been 17 years old, and she had died in a building that was burning because a man had removed his asset and left 2 girls as collateral and gone home. And her mother had been alive. For 8 years, Elena Whitfield had been alive. Where is she? Amara said. Her voice came out strange, stripped of the careful evenness she maintained, just the raw question underneath. Safe, Min-jae said. Hidden. I've had her protected for... She turned around. Where is she? He looked at her face and made a decision. New Jersey, a residence I maintain through a separate structure. She's been there for 6 years. Before that, she moved. June was still looking for her, initially, because she had seen enough to be dangerous to him. I provided security. You've known where she was for 6 years. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know you existed, he said, until 4 months ago, when Seong-won flagged your investigation. By then, he stopped. By then what? By then I was trying to determine whether you were a threat or an asset before I made any decision about disclosure. His voice was steady. That was the wrong calculation. I recognized that. The fury that came through her was so large it almost had no shape. She stood at the window with her hands shaking and her sister's age in her head. 17. Jade had been 17. And she looked at the man in the wheelchair who had saved her life and hidden her mother and spent 18 months building a case against Jun Tae-hyun. And she felt everything she had organized her life around for 8 years become something different and more terrible and more complicated. And she did not know what to do with that. She was still standing there when the door opened. Chang-min. His face was doing something unusual. The professional neutrality was cracked along one edge. Something urgent pushing through. We have a problem, he said. Min-jae looked at him. June pulled the secondary ledger records this morning, Chang-min said. The ones in the restricted archive. He looked at Amara. He knows someone accessed the routing document. The air in the room changed. When? Min-jae said. 40 minutes ago. He ran an access log query. He knows someone was in the archive last night between 2 and 5 a.m. Chang-min's jaw was tight. He's been in Min-jae's office for the last 20 minutes, with the door closed. Min-jae looked at Amara. She was already doing the calculation. If June knew the routing document had been accessed, he knew someone had found the connection. And if he was in Min-jae's office, he was either trying to determine how much Min-jae knew, or he was trying to determine something else. Is anyone else in the office with him? Min-jae said. Han Byung-soo. Min-jae's expression didn't change, but Amara had been studying his face for a week, and she saw what moved through his eyes. Something quick and dark that was gone before it fully formed. Who is Han Byung-soo? She said. My security chief, Min-jae said. 12 years. June's? Min-jae said nothing for 1 second too long. Get out of this room, he said to Amara. Now, Chang-min. I'm not leaving, she said. Amara, if June knows the document was accessed, he knows it was me or you. Either way, I'm already in this. Running doesn't change that. She picked up her bag. What I need to know right now is whether Han Byung-soo is June's or yours. Min-jae looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually lasted. I don't know, he said. And the weight of those 3 words, coming from a man who built his entire survival on knowing, was the most frightening thing she had heard in this building. The door to the archive room opened without a knock. Jun Tae-hyun stood in the doorway. His composed warmth was in place, exactly as it always was. The slight smile, the easy posture, the eyes that were warm and completely unreadable underneath the warmth. He looked at Amara, and then at Min-jae, and then at the closed laptop on the table between them. Good morning, he said. I see I'm not the first one in early. Nobody said anything. June walked into the room. He moved the way he always moved, without hurry, without aggression, as if the specific architecture of the moment was exactly what he would have chosen himself. He stopped at the table. He looked at the laptop. "Long night?" he said to Amara. "Research," she said. Her voice was even. The shaking in her hands had stopped, which was something her body apparently understood how to do when the threat became immediate enough. He nodded. "I appreciate dedication." He looked at Minjae. "I wanted to flag something with you. The archive access logs show some unusual activity last night. Deep retrieval in the restricted section. It may be a system anomaly. Changmin's team should look at it." He was watching Minjae's face. Minjae looked back at him with the stillness that Amara now understood was not emptiness but containment. A man holding a very large thing very still, so it didn't move wrong. "I'll have it checked," Minjae said. "Good." June smiled, looked at Amara again. "How are you finding the work? Settling in?" "It's interesting," she said. "Good. We need good people." He said it warmly, as if the three of them were colleagues in a completely ordinary office, having a completely ordinary morning. "I'll leave you to it." He left. The door closed. Changmin exhaled. Minjae looked at Amara, and she looked at him, and they were both calculating the same thing at the same speed. June knew. Not everything, not yet, but he knew the archive had been touched, and he had come to look at their faces when he mentioned it, and he had gotten something from what he saw, and he was now going back to whatever he was building and adjusting it. "How much time do we have?" she said. "Days," Minjae said. "Maybe less." "The council meeting is in 6 days." She thought about the routing document, about her mother's name, about June standing in the doorway with his composed warmth and his smile and the thing underneath both that she could see clearly now. The particular patience of a man who had been executing a very long plan and was close enough to the end of it that he could afford to be patient for a few more days. "He's going to move before the meeting," she said. "Yes." "He has Han Byung-soo." "Possibly." "Min Jae." She said his name the way you said something when you needed the person to stop managing the information and give you the actual weight of it. "If Han Byung-soo is June's, how many of your security structure does that compromise?" He looked at her. 60%, he said. The number sat between them. She picked up her bag. "Then we have less than days," she said, "and I need to see my mother." Minjae didn't argue. He looked at her face, the controlled surface of it, and whatever he could see underneath the control, the 8 years of it, the weight of it. And he made a call on his phone and gave an address in New Jersey in a quiet voice. And then he looked at Amara and said, "I'm coming with you." "You don't have to." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm coming with you." She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had pulled her out of a burning building and hidden her mother and carried his own version of that night for 8 years alongside hers, parallel and never intersecting until a rainy Tuesday in a cafe with bad coffee. She looked at him and felt the hatred she had arrived with, the clean, organizing hatred that had structured 8 years of her life, shift into something more complicated and less useful, and in the space of the worst morning she had had in recent memory, more honest. "Then let's go," she said. And they went, truth of the thing that had broken both of them, into a morning that was about to get significantly worse before it offered anything resembling a way through. The drive to New Jersey took 40 minutes. Amara sat in the back of Minjae's car with her bag on her lap and her hands still and her eyes on the window, watching the city give way to the bridge and the bridge give way to the other side of the river. And she did not speak, and Minjae did not speak. And Donghyun drove with the focused quiet of a man who understood that the silence in his back seat was load-bearing. She had spent the drive organizing what she knew into what she could use. Her mother was alive. Her mother had been a compromised informant, coerced or maneuvered into a position she hadn't chosen, and then extracted by June before the building burned, which meant Elena Whitfield had known what was coming and had not been able to stop it, and had lived with that for 8 years in a house in New Jersey, with Minjae's security keeping her hidden from the man who had used her. Amara thought about what that weight felt like. She thought she might actually know. The residence was a house on a quiet street, 2 stories, modest from the outside, the kind of house that didn't invite attention, which was clearly the point. A man was sitting in a car across the street who stopped being visible as a man sitting in a car the moment you looked at him with any real attention. Minjae's security. She noted him. Donghyun stopped the car. Minjae made a call from the back seat, 2 sentences in Korean, and then a woman came to the front door of the house. She was 61 years old. Amara knew her mother's age the way she knew her own birthday, without thinking about it, just a fact that lived in her body. Amara Whitfield was 61, and she looked it in some ways and didn't in others. Her hair had gone mostly gray. She was thinner than the photographs. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and she looked at the car, and she went very still. Amara got out. Her mother's hand tightened on the door frame. Neither of them moved for a moment that was too large to measure in seconds. Then Elena said her name. Just that. One word, her daughter's name, in the voice that had read her stories when she was small, and Amara's 8 years of careful architecture cracked straight down the middle. She crossed the distance between them. The reunion happened in the doorway and then in the small living room beyond it, and Minjae stayed in the car, which was the right call, and he had known it was the right call without being told, and Donghyun kept the engine running at a respectful idle. Inside, they held each other for a long time without speaking. Her mother smelled like the same soap she had always used, which was the detail that broke Amara completely, and then put her back together, because it was so ordinary, so stubbornly ordinary, against 8 years of loss. When they separated, Amara held her mother's face in both hands and looked at her. "I know," her mother said, before Amara could say anything. "I know you found it. Tell me." Amara saw, "Tell me. All of it, right now." Elena sat. Amara sat across from her, and her mother told her, in the halting, ashamed, exhausted way of someone who had been carrying a confession for 8 years and had given up hope of ever being able to give it. The debt had been real, a medical debt, accrued when Amara's father was dying years before the fire. Elena had borrowed from sources she hadn't fully understood, and by the time she understood them, the debt had been acquired by a holding structure she couldn't trace. The contact came 18 months before the fire. A man she would later understand was working for June, offering a resolution. All she had to do was report on the activity in her building, the building where she worked as a property manager. The building that June, she now understood, already knew was being used by a rival organization for meetings and storage. "I didn't know anyone would get hurt," Elena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "They told me it was surveillance only. Information. I told them when meetings happened, who came, how many people." "And Jade," Amara said, her mother's face. "I didn't know the building was going to burn," she said. "I swear to you, 2 hours before it happened, the same man called and told me to get out, to take you and Jade and leave. I tried to reach you. Your phone, Jade's phone. Jade wasn't answering. You were out. I didn't know where." "I was 2 blocks away," Amara said. "I came back when I saw the smoke." Elena closed her eyes. "I know," her mother said. "I know." They sat in the weight of it. 8 years of it, the shape it had made in both of them, the way it had organized their lives around a center of grief that turned out to have a more complicated architecture than either of them had been able to look at directly. "He protected you," Amara said. "Minjae. He found me 3 days after. I was hiding. I didn't know what June would do, whether I was a liability now. Minji came himself." She opened her eyes. "He told me what had actually happened, that the intelligence had been falsified, that he hadn't known what the real target was." She paused. "I believed him. I don't know if that was the right—" "It was," Amara said. She didn't say it to comfort her mother. She said it because she had spent a week reading Minjae, and she was reasonably certain it was true. Her phone vibrated. She looked at it. Minjae. One word. Now. She stood. Her mother looked up at her. "I have to go," Amara said. "We have—" She stopped, looked at her mother's face, at the gray in her hair and the thinness and the 8 years of a confession she'd been carrying alone. "I'm coming back," she said. "After this is done. We have a lot of time to make up for." Elena caught her hand, held it for a moment, looked at the scar on her wrist, the same scar she had seen the night it happened, in a hospital room she had not been able to go to, watching from a distance while Minjae's people arranged care for a girl who didn't know her mother was 3 floors away. Be careful, Elena said. I know how to be careful, Amara said. She left. In the car, Min-jae had his phone to his ear. He finished the call as she got in and looked at her face. Took in whatever was there, the redness around her eyes that she hadn't been able to prevent, the set of her jaw that was harder than it had been this morning, and said nothing about any of it. June moved, he said. He called an emergency session with 3 council members. He's framing it as a security concern, an internal breach in the archive. He paused. He's naming you. He's making his move. He's testing the ground first. If the council members respond to the security concern framing, he has cover to act before the scheduled meeting. His jaw tightened. We have maybe 4 hours before this becomes uncontainable. Han Byung-soo? Confirmed. Changmin found the communication. Byung-soo has been routing security rotation schedules to a third party for 6 months. He looked at her. We've been operating with compromised security for 6 months, which means June knows the building's weak points. He knows everything. The car was moving. Back toward the bridge, back toward the city, back towards the 4-hour window they had before Jun Tae-hyun finished building the ground he was going to stand on when he ended Min-jae's operation. The evidence, Amara said. What we have. The routing document, the communication archive, the photograph of your mother. He laid it out flatly. It's enough to establish Jun's involvement in the financial structure. It's not enough on its own to establish that he fabricated the intelligence for the operation. A good lawyer pulls those apart. The secondary ledger. I need Byung-soo to confirm the chain of custody on it before it's admissible to the council. Without that, June disputes its authenticity, and we're in a word-against-word situation. He looked at the bridge ahead, which he wins, because he has the council relationships, and I've been in a wheelchair for 8 years. The last part came out without inflection. A fact, stated. She looked at him. The wheelchair. It communicates incapacity. To men like the council members, a man in a wheelchair is already half defeated. He said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. June has been cultivating that perception for years. It's part of his strategy. Then we take it from him, Amara said. He looked at her. The wheelchair is part of how he sees you, she said. Part of how the council sees you. You told me the night before the meeting that you'd been rebuilding your strength. She held his gaze. How much? Enough to stand, he said, with assistance, for limited time. Then we use it. He was quiet. Not as a performance, she said, as the truth, because that's what it is. You've been rebuilding. He's been waiting for you to stay down. She let that sit. Don't stay down. Donghyun kept driving. The bridge passed beneath them. The city came back, enormous and indifferent, and full of the morning's ordinary life pressing on around their crisis. The next 3 hours were the most compressed of Amara's professional life. They went back to the building and split the work in a way that required no discussion. She took the archive, he took the council communications. Changmin ran interference on June's emergency session by routing a procedural delay through a sympathetic council member Min-jae had cultivated for exactly this kind of situation. The delay bought them 90 minutes. Amara worked. She had done financial forensics under pressure before, but not like this. Not with a 4-hour window and a 60% compromised security structure, and the knowledge that the man she was building the case against was 3 floors away doing his own building. She moved through the archive with the speed of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for now, pulling documents, cross-referencing dates, constructing the chain that linked June's financial routing to the fabricated intelligence to the specific communications that showed he had known the real contents of the target building and had chosen to proceed anyway. At the 2-hour mark, she had enough. Not everything. Not the perfect case she would have wanted if she'd had weeks and proper legal resources. But enough. Enough to put in front of the council and make them look at Jun Tae-hyun and see the structure of what he'd done, the years of it, the patience of it, the way he had built his betrayal into the foundation of Min-jae's operation like a slow rot nobody had thought to check for. She printed it. Physical copies, 6 sets. She trusted paper in this moment more than she trusted any network. She was collating the sets when the door opened, and it wasn't Changmin. Han Byung-soo was a broad man, 50 years old, with the kind of physical density that came from spending his career in security work. He had, for 12 years, been Min-jae's security chief. He stood in the doorway of the archive room with two men behind him and looked at Amara with the specific expression of a man who had already made his decision and was past the point of reconsidering it. "I need you to come with me," he said. She looked at the papers in her hands, at the 6 sets of documents she had just spent 2 hours constructing. She looked at him. "No," she said. He came into the room. What happened next was not graceful. Amara was not a fighter in the trained sense. She had practical self-defense, the kind of skills you picked up when you spent years investigating dangerous people and needed to understand that you couldn't always rely on distance as your protection. She threw the first set of documents at Byung-Soo's face, which was not a combat move, but it used his instinctive flinch to buy her 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she put the archive room's heavy table between herself and the 2 men behind him and grabbed the laptop. "Min Jae," she said, loud enough to be heard in the hallway if anyone was there. Byung-Soo came around the table. She backed toward the window, which was not an exit, 14th floor, no exit. But it put the width of the room between them, and she was calculating, fast and cold, whether she could get to the door, whether she could get to her phone, whether the documents she had printed were going to survive this encounter, or whether Byung-Soo's job right now was specifically to make sure they didn't. The door hit the wall. Changmin came through it moving fast, and behind him 2 men she recognized as Min Jae's personal security. Not the building security, which Byung-Soo controlled, but the 2 who stayed specifically with Min Jae and reported specifically to him. Byung-Soo stopped. The room was full. Nobody was moving. The 2 men behind Byung-Soo looked at the 2 men behind Changmin and did the arithmetic. "Step away from her," Changmin said. His voice was very calm in the way of someone who had trained the calm in. Byung-Soo looked at Amara, at the laptop she was holding, at the papers scattered across the floor from the set she'd thrown. He stepped back. "Collect the documents," Amara said to Changmin, not taking her eyes off Byung-Soo. Her voice was steady. Her heart was doing something percussive behind her ribs that she was choosing to ignore. Changmin collected them. "Han Byung-Soo," she said. She looked at the man who had given June 6 months of security rotation schedules, who had been selling the blueprints of Min Jae's operation piece by piece for half a year. "You should have picked a different side." He looked at her with the flat expression of a man who had made his calculation and was standing in the results of it. "Take him," Changmin said to the 2 men behind him. They did. Amara sat down on the floor against the wall with the laptop in her lap and breathed. Just breathed, 3 full cycles, letting her heart do what it needed to do without fighting it. Then she stood up. "Where's Min Jae?" she said. "Council room," Changmin said. He looked at the papers, at her, at the door. "June called the session early, 30 minutes ago." Min Jae went in. She felt something cold move through her. "He went in alone?" "He went in with Ryu and Park Seung-won, but June has 3 council members and—" Changmin stopped. "And what?" "And 2 men in the room who we now know are Byung-Soo's." She was already moving. The council room was on the 12th floor, a room she had not been in before. Large, formal in the specific way of rooms where power was performed. A long table with high-backed chairs and the kind of lighting that was meant to communicate authority. She heard June's voice before she reached the door. She did not knock. She opened the door and walked in. June was standing at the head of the table. Min Jae was at the far end in his wheelchair, with Ryu and Seung-won flanking him. 3 council members, older men, 2 Korean, one whose background she didn't know, sat along the sides. 2 men she now recognized as compromised stood near the room's secondary exit. Everyone looked at her. June looked at her with the composed warmth intact, and something underneath it that was not warm at all. He had been mid-sentence. He finished it. "As I was saying," he said, addressing the council, "the integrity of the archive has been compromised by an outside operative brought in without proper vetting. The security risk alone—" "The security risk," Amara said, walking toward the table, "is sitting at the head of it." She put the documents down in front of the nearest council member. Then she moved to the next and put a set in front of him. She was aware of the 2 compromised men near the exit tracking her movement, aware of the distance between herself and Min Jae at the far end of the table, aware of June watching her with the patience of a man deciding exactly when to stop being patient. "What is this?" the first council member said. He was looking at the routing document, at the account structure, at the dates. "Financial records," she said. showing the movement of funds through a routing structure authorized by a code that originates from this organization's internal finance system, specifically from access credentials belonging to Jun Tae-hyun. She moved to the third council member, put the last set down. The routing connected an outer holding account, controlled by June, to a second account used to fund a field operation 8 years ago, an operation based on intelligence that was fabricated. This is, June started. There's more. She reached the center of the table. Communications Archive, pages 4 through 9. A conversation between an unidentified account and June's personal communications address 2 weeks before the operation, confirming that the target building's actual contents, civilian and operational, not exclusively hostile, were known in advance. Silence. The first council member was reading. His face was doing something careful and unhappy. June knew what was in that building, she said. He chose to proceed. He fabricated the intelligence that reached Min Jae's desk, approved the operation through a man who trusted his intelligence structure, and then used the resulting tragedy to damage Min Jae's reputation with this council and with the broader network. She let that land, while simultaneously using the operation's chaos to eliminate a rival faction whose removal benefited a separate syndicate June has been working with for a decade. She had the room now. She could feel it, the attention of the council members shifting, the quality of it changing from defensive to something more careful and more open. June moved, not dramatically. He stepped away from the head of the table, one hand going to his jacket. The two men near the exit moved with him, a coordinated shift, 3 bodies adjusting their positions, and the temperature in the room went from tense to dangerous in the space of 2 seconds. "That's enough," June said. The warmth was gone. Underneath it was something efficient and cold that she recognized as the real face of the thing she had been studying for 2 weeks. "Min Jae, you brought an operative into this organization who has spent months building a case designed to destroy me. Whatever she's found, whatever she thinks she's found..." "She found the truth," Min Jae said. His voice from the end of the table was quiet and absolute. The room went still. June looked at him. "You've been sitting in that wheelchair for 8 years," June said, "because of a bad operation, bad intelligence. It happens. It happened. I have been loyal to you through every consequence of that night. You built the intelligence," Min Jae said. "You chose the target. You told me it was clean." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "I trusted you more than I have trusted anyone in my life, and you used that to burn a building full of people who had nothing to do with what you were trying to accomplish." "Min Jae, don't." The single word had the weight of 11 years in it. "Don't say my name like we're still what we were. We haven't been that since the night you made your choice and left me to carry it." June's jaw tightened. The composed warmth was entirely gone now, and what replaced it was something Amara had suspected was underneath all along. A precise, calculated fury at being outmaneuvered, not at being caught, not at being confronted with what he'd done, but at the operational failure of having it exposed. There was no guilt in his face. There was only the assessment of a man running contingencies. His hand came out of his jacket. Amara was closer to him than Min Jae was. She moved without deciding to move, pure reflex, the body doing what the mind had trained it to do, crossing the distance between her position and his in 3 steps and catching his wrist with both hands before what he was reaching for cleared his jacket. They struggled for 1 brutal second. He was stronger than he looked, which she should have expected, and her leverage was awkward, and the edge of the table caught her hip hard enough to send pain shooting up her side. She held his wrist, turned it. He shifted his weight. Ryu hit him from the other side. It was over in 4 seconds. June was against the table, Ryu's forearm across his shoulders. The object, a phone, not a weapon, which recalibrated the moment in a way that left Amara breathing hard and uncertain, clattering across the table's surface. A phone. He'd been reaching for a phone. The 2 men near the exit had moved toward the table and then stopped, caught between their instruction and the presence of Seong-won and Changmin, who had come through the door behind Amara at some point she hadn't tracked. The council members were very still. June straightened. Ryu kept a hand on his shoulder. He looked at the phone on the table, and then he looked at Amara, and for the first time his expression contained something she hadn't seen on him before. Assessment. Genuine recalibrating assessment of a situation that had not gone the way he'd planned. "You," he said to her, not with rage, with something more careful. Who are you, actually? Amara Whitfield, she said. Her hip was throbbing, her hands were steady. My mother is Elena Whitfield. My sister was Jade Whitfield. She held his gaze. She was 17. Something moved across June's face. Not guilt. She'd decided he didn't have access to that. But recognition. The specific recognition of a man confronted with the human dimensions of an operational decision he had made without looking at them. It lasted less than a second. The council should make its determination, he said, addressing the room as if the last 30 seconds hadn't happened, as if the documents weren't in front of 3 men reading them, as if the phone wasn't on the table. Whatever accusations have been made, the proper process— June, Min-jae's voice. Everyone looked at the end of the table. Min-jae's hands were on the arms of the wheelchair. His jaw was set. His eyes were on June with 11 years of accumulated weight in them. The weight of a friendship built on a betrayal, a trust that had been the most expensive thing he had ever extended. And then, slowly, with the effort visible in his arms and his jaw, and the precise controlled way he managed the transfer of weight, Kang Min-jae began to stand. The room held its breath. He rose from the wheelchair by degrees, not smoothly, not without cost, his left leg taking the weight unevenly, one hand on the arm of the chair, the other finding the edge of the table. His face showed the effort without hiding it, which was, Amara understood, the entire point. He had hidden the progress of his recovery for years because weakness invited attack. He had used the wheelchair as armor and camouflage, and now he was taking that camouflage off in front of the men who had been told, for 8 years, that he was broken. He stood. Not perfectly. Not the way a man stands in a film. He stood the way a person stands when standing is an act of genuine cost, when the body has been rebuilt slowly and incompletely, and the standing is not a triumph but a statement. I am still here. I have been here. You did not finish me. The council members stared. June stared. Amara stood at the middle of the table with her hip aching and her heart doing that percussive thing again, and she watched Kang Min-jae stand up, and she thought about the cafe with the bad coffee, and the documents on the floor, and her mother's hand on her wrist, and 8 years of a story that had turned out to be large enough to contain both of them. You thought I was finished, Min-jae said to June. His voice was even. He was standing, and the standing was costing him, and his voice was even. You have been running this organization on the assumption that I was finished. Every decision you've made for the last 8 years has been built on that foundation. He looked at the council members. Look at that foundation now. The room was absolutely silent. June looked at Min-jae standing at the end of the table. And for the first time in the 11 years, Amara would come to understand they had known each other. Something crossed Jun Tae-hyun's face that was not calculation, not warmth, not the composed efficiency of a man executing a long plan. It was fear, not of Min-jae standing, of what it meant that Min-jae was standing, what it meant for every assumption his plan had been built on, every angle he had calculated, every contingency that had been predicated on a man who stayed in a wheelchair and got smaller every year while June got larger. The foundation was wrong. It had always been wrong. And the plan built on top of it was coming down. Gentlemen, Amara said to the council members, because the moment needed to be closed before June could find his contingency, before the 2 men near the exit could recalculate their positions, before the room gave him any more time to think. She put her hands flat on the table. You have the documents. You have the financial records. You have the communications. She looked at each of them in turn. You have a man standing in front of you who has been running this organization for 8 years under the assumption that it was being managed honestly. She looked at June. And you have the man who made sure it wasn't. The first council member looked at his documents. He looked at June. He looked at Min-jae, standing at the end of the table at genuine cost, holding himself upright by the combination of rebuilt strength and something that was not strength exactly, but was adjacent to it. The refusal of a man who had been waiting 8 years for this room to finally tell him the truth. The council member set down his papers. Sit down, June, he said. June did not sit down. He looked at the room. The council members, Ryu, Changmin, Seung-won, Amara, Min-jae, standing. And he ran his calculation one more time, fast and complete, and Amara watched him run it and watched him arrive at the result. and the result was the same from every angle he could approach it. He had lost. His hand moved toward his jacket again. Not the phone this time, and the room moved with him, every person in it making the same calculation at the same speed, and Amara was already stepping forward when Min Jae said, with a quiet authority that stopped the room completely, "Don't." Just that. One word. June stopped. He looked at Min Jae across the length of the table, at the man he had betrayed and underestimated and built an 8-year plan around defeating, at the man who was standing. Something moved across his face that was the closest thing to an honest emotion Amara had seen from him. And then it was gone. And then everything happened at once. June reached the secondary exit in 2 strides. He was fast, faster than a man his age and build had any right to be, and Amara registered this as the specific speed of someone who had been maintaining a physical readiness that his public persona of administrative calm had been carefully concealing. He hit the door with his shoulder, and it swung open, and he was gone into the stairwell before anyone in the room had fully processed that he was moving. The 2 men who had been stationed near the exit moved with him, which told her they had been waiting for exactly this. A contingency signal she hadn't seen pass between them, something in June's posture or his positioning that had communicated without words that the plan had shifted to extraction. Ryu was already moving. "Stay," Min Jae said. Not to Ryu, to the room. His voice had the specific authority of a man who had spent decades being the person whose voice stopped rooms, and the room stopped. Then, to Ryu, "Take Changmin, southeast stairwell. He'll go to the garage." Ryu went. Min Jae lowered himself back into the wheelchair with the controlled care of a man who understood exactly how much his body had just given and was not going to ask it for more than it had left. Amara watched him do it, the way he managed the descent, hands on the arms, weight distributed deliberately, and she understood that the standing had cost him more than he had let show while he was doing it. He looked at the council members. "Gentlemen, I need the room." They left. The first council member paused at the door with his copy of the documents in his hand and looked at Min Jae for a moment, a long look, the kind that contained a recalibration of many things. And then he nodded, once, and went. The room was empty except for the 2 of them. Amara stood at the middle of the table with her hand pressed to her hip where the table edge had caught her. The pain had settled from sharp to a deep, consistent ache. She breathed through it. "He'll have a car," she said. "Ryu knows the garage structure." "If he gets out of the building, he won't." Min Jae said it with a flatness that was not bravado. It was the statement of a man who had, while everyone else was focused on the council room, been running the operational containment in parallel. He held up his phone. "The building perimeter has been covered by my people for the last 90 minutes. Not Byung-Soo's rotation, mine." He paused. "I started moving them when you called me from the archive room." She looked at him. "You knew he'd run," she said. "I knew that when the evidence was in front of the council, there was nothing left for him here. Running was the only calculation that made sense." He set the phone down. "June has always been very good at making the calculation that makes sense." She pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because she needed to, because her hip was making a case for it that was becoming difficult to argue with. They waited. It took 11 minutes. Ryu came back through the door with Changmin behind him and 2 other men, and Jun Tae-hyun between them with his wrists bound behind him with a cable tie, the unglamorous, practical, zip-tie reality of a man who had been caught in a parking garage trying to reach a car that had not been where he'd arranged for it to be. There was a cut above his left eye, shallow, the kind that came from moving fast in a concrete space and misjudging a corner. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. His composure was intact, which was somehow the most disturbing part. He walked into the council room between 2 men who were holding his arms, and he looked like a man who had taken a meeting that had gone slightly worse than expected. He looked at Min Jae. "I want to talk to you," he said. "Alone." "No," Min Jae said. "Min Jae, you don't get to call me that anymore." He said it without heat, just a fact, stated in the new reality of the room. "You get to answer for what you did. That's all you get now." June looked at him for a long. Then he looked at Amara, and there was something in his assessment of her that had changed. A different quality of attention, not the warm, professional interest he'd deployed for 2 weeks, but something more direct, and, she thought, more honest. "You're Elena's daughter," he said. Yes. You look like her. He said it without apparent calculation. An observation, the kind that comes out of a person before they've decided whether to allow it. She talked about you, both of you. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, still not guilt, but the specific discomfort of a man confronted with the human texture of a decision he had made in operational terms. She was proud of you. Don't, Amara said. I'm not asking for anything. I know what you're doing. You're humanizing yourself, making me see you as a person who knew my mother's name and my sister's face. She held his gaze. I already see you as a person. That's not a defense. June closed his mouth. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Min-jae. I need you to understand, he said, that what I built, the structure, the organization's reach over the last decade, none of that would exist without what I did. The rival faction would have destroyed everything you had within 3 years. The operation that night was the only way to cut them off at the source. Jade Whitfield was 17 years old, Min-jae said. June stopped. She was 17, Min-jae said again, quietly, with the specific weight of a man who had been carrying that number for 8 years alongside his own damage, alongside his own wheelchair, alongside every morning he had woken up to the consequences of a mission he had approved on intelligence he had trusted. She was inside a building you knew the contents of. You made a calculation that she and her sister were acceptable losses for an operational objective. That is what you need me to understand. The organization, tell me her name. June's jaw tightened. Tell me her name, Min-jae said. If you're going to explain to me why she died, tell me her name first. The silence stretched. June did not say her name. Either he didn't remember it, which was its own answer, or he remembered it and understood that saying it in this room would collapse the operational framing he was trying to maintain around what he'd done. Either way, he said nothing. Take him, Kim, Min-jae said to Ryu. Ryu took him. June walked out of the council room between two men, and as he reached the door, he turned and looked back at Min-jae one more time, and whatever was in his expression in that final look was something Amara couldn't fully read, too layered, too long, 11 years of a relationship that had been built on a betrayal at its foundation. And whatever Jun Tae-hyun felt about the man he had used and undermined and underestimated for all of those years was not something that resolved cleanly into any single readable emotion. Then he was gone. The door closed. Min-jae sat in the empty council room for a moment with his hands on the arms of the wheelchair and his eyes on the door. Amar sat across the long table from him and did not break the silence, because the silence had the shape of something that needed to be allowed to be what it was. After a while, he said, "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would." "No," she said. "It never does." "I expected—" He stopped. Tried again. "I expected it to feel like something was finished." "Something is. Not the right something." He looked at the table, at the scattered documents, the evidence that had just dismantled 11 years of a betrayal built into the structure of his life. The right something would be Jade Whitfield being 25 years old and doing whatever she was going to do with her life. He said it plainly, without performance. "That's finished. That finished 8 years ago. This is just—" He paused. "The accounting." Amara pressed her hand flat against the table. "The accounting matters," she said. "I know. It's not enough. But it matters." He looked at her. "Yes." They sat for another moment, then she said, "I have to go back to New Jersey." "I know. My mother needs—" She stopped, started again. "There's a lot we need to say to each other. It's going to take time." "Take the car," he said. "Dong-hyun will drive you." "I'll get my own car." "Amara." She looked at him. "Take the car," he said. Not as a crime lord managing logistics. As a man who wanted her to have something easy right now, even if it was just the small thing of not having to call a cab. She took the car. The drive back to New Jersey was different from the morning's drive. The day had moved into late afternoon, the light going amber over the bridge, the water below it catching it in pieces. Dong-hyun drove with the same quiet he always drove with, and Amara sat in the back and let the motion of the car do what car motion did. The physical rhythm of it, forward, continuous, the world moving past the window at a pace that allowed the mind to slow its emergency processing and begin the longer, harder work of integrating what had happened. Jade. She thought about Jade, 17, with their mother's cheekbones and a laugh that was too loud for indoor spaces, and strong opinions about music that she defended with a seriousness that was both completely genuine and completely unaware of how funny it was. Jade, who had been going to study architecture because she liked the idea of building things that people lived their whole lives inside. Jade, who had been 17 and had died in a burning building because a man had made a calculation about acceptable losses. Amara let herself think about her. Really think. Not the way she had been thinking about her for 8 years, as a wound to be investigated, a death to be answered for, but the actual person, the girl, the specific irreplaceable texture of her. She let herself grieve without the structure of purpose around it for the first time in 8 years. It lasted the length of the bridge. By the time Dong-hyun pulled up to the New Jersey house, she had put it somewhere that wasn't gone, but wasn't the center of everything. The grief had a place. It had earned a place. She was going to have to learn how to carry it differently. Now that the investigation that had organized it was over, and she didn't know yet what that looked like, but she knew she wasn't going to figure it out today. Today, she was going to sit with her mother. Elena opened the door before she reached it. She must have been watching the window. Of course she had been watching the window. She had been watching windows for 8 years, waiting for something that might resolve. She stood in the doorway with her gray hair and her thinness and her 61 years of a life that had bent under an enormous weight and had not entirely broken, and she looked at her daughter's face. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," Amara said. Her mother made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite relief, but existed in the territory between them where language didn't quite reach, and she stepped back to let Amara in. They sat in the small living room as the afternoon light shifted, and they talked. Not about the investigation, not about June or Min Jae or the routing document or the accounting of the night 8 years ago. About Jade. About the specific things, the loud laugh, the architecture ambition, the music opinions, the way she'd always stolen the covers and then denied it with complete conviction in the morning. About the father who had died years before any of this, and whose absence had started the financial spiral that had made Elena vulnerable. About the years in between, the ones they had each spent separately carrying versions of the same weight. They talked until the light was gone and the room was dark, and neither of them got up to turn on a lamp. At some point in the dark, Elena said, "I know you hate what I did." "I don't hate what you did," Amara said. "I understand it better than I want to." "That's not the same as, I know." She reached across in the dark and found her mother's hand. "I know it's not the same. We're going to have to work out what it is over time." She paused. "But I'm done spending my life on what I hate. I'm done with that as an organizing principle." Her mother held her hand in the dark. "What does that leave?" Elena said. Amara thought about it. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to find out." She stayed that, slept in a bed that was not her own, in a house she had never been in, and slept actual sleep, not the shallow strategic rest she had been managing for 2 weeks. The way a person sleeps when the emergency has finally resolved and the body decides it is allowed to stop. She dreamed about Jade. Not the fire. Just Jade, being 17, arguing about music with complete conviction, and in the dream Amara let her win the argument, which was the right call, and which Jade accepted with a grin that had their mother's cheekbones in it. She woke up in the morning and the grief was still there, and it was not going to stop being there, but it had a different shape than it had for 8 years. And the different shape was one she thought she could live around. She had coffee with her mother in the kitchen, both of them quiet in the particular easy quiet of people who have said the important things and are now just existing in the same space. And when she left mid-morning, they held each other for a long time in the doorway. "I'll come back," Amara said. "I know," her mother said. And then, "Don't wait 8 years this time." Amara almost laughed. Almost. "I won't," she said. She went back to the city. The next 2 weeks were the complicated administrative aftermath of something that had looked, in the middle of it, like a single dramatic confrontation but turned out, in its resolution, to involve an enormous amount of paperwork and difficult conversation and organizational restructuring that moved at the pace of institutions rather than the pace of crisis. Jun Tae-hyun was not handed to law enforcement. That was a decision made by the council in consultation with Min Jae, and it was one that Amara had opinions about and expressed them, and the response she received was both practical and unsatisfying in the specific way of responses that are both practical and unsatisfying. The organization's relationship with formal legal structures was what it was. June would face the accounting of his own world, which was a different kind of accounting than the one Amara would have chosen, and she had to decide what to do with that distinction. She decided to hold it, to know what it was and not pretend it was something else, and to understand that what she had achieved, the truth, exposed in front of the people whose world it had damaged, was real even if it wasn't the form of justice she had wanted. Han Byung-soo was removed from the organization and from New York, the details of which she was not told and did not ask about. The council, in the days following the confrontation, reoriented around Min Jae with a thoroughness that suggested the 8 years of June's slow cultivation of their doubt had been more fragile than it appeared, or perhaps that men who deal in power recognize it when it stands up from a wheelchair in a room and decides to stop being underestimated. Chang Min was promoted. He appeared in the aftermath slightly embarrassed by this, which made Amara like him more. She stayed. Not because she had agreed to stay. She had agreed to 6 weeks, and the 6 weeks were nearly done. She stayed because there was still work she wanted to finish. The rival syndicate that June had been collaborating with, the financial structure that still needed to be mapped and closed off, the loose ends that an investigation of this kind always had, the threads that led to other threads if you pulled them. She was good at this work. She had always been good at this work. And for the first time in 8 years, she was doing it without the specific fuel of hatred underneath it, which turned out to make her neither better nor worse at it, but differently powered, steadier, longer burning, less likely to go somewhere reckless because the grief demanded it. She went back to New Jersey on Saturdays. It was not uncomplicated. The history between her and her mother was not going to be simple, was not going to resolve into an uncomplicated warmth just because the external crisis that had separated them was done. There were things Elena had done that Amara was going to have to work at forgiving, in the specific slow way that actual forgiveness worked. Not a decision, but a practice. Not a moment, but a direction. The same direction chosen again and again over time until it became the way you face things. But she went back. Every Saturday, they had coffee and they talked, and they were quiet together and they worked on it. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the council room confrontation, Min Jae found her in the archive space where she was still working at 8 o'clock with a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. He came in and looked at the coffee and said, "That's the second cup you've let go cold today." "I know." The barista at the cafe made a point of telling me that if you're going to let coffee go cold, you should at least let it go cold somewhere with better coffee. She looked at him. "You talked to the barista about my coffee habits?" He volunteered the information. He's observant. He moved to the window. The city was doing its evening thing, the light going, the buildings beginning to glow. "How much longer on the syndicate mapping?" "Another week, maybe 10 days. "And then?" She looked at the screen. At the financial architecture she was still untangling, the lattice of accounts and routing codes and holding structures that June had built over a decade to support his collaboration with the outside syndicate. "And then I'll have given you everything I can trace. The rest is going to take people with access I don't have." "You could have that access," he said, carefully, not pushing, stating. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to become something you're not," he said. "You're an investigator. That's what you do, and you're better at it than anyone I've had access to." He paused. "I'm suggesting that the skills you've spent 8 years developing don't have to be retired just because the original reason for developing them is resolved. You want to hire me. I want to offer you a position, which you can take or not, on your terms, with whatever conditions you set." He met her eyes. "You'd answer to yourself. I'd be a client, not a boss." She thought about what it meant to do this work for a man who ran an organization that was what it was. Not clean, not simple, operating in the space between legal and illegal, where enormous amounts of actual power actually lived. She thought about the difference between doing this work in service of vengeance and doing it in service of something more complex and more honest. She thought about what she was good at and what she wanted to do with being good at it. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time." "That's not something you actually believe in?" He almost smiled. "No, but I'm trying." She looked at him, at the man in the wheelchair who had pulled her out of a burning building and hidden her mother and stood up in a council room to tell the truth at genuine cost to his body, who was also a man who had approved the operation that burned the building in the first place, who was also a man who had lived with those two facts in the same body for 8 years without letting either of them cancel the other out. He was not a good man in any simple sense. She didn't think he would claim to be. But he was. She had decided this slowly, over weeks of watching him make decisions. A man who was trying to be a different kind of man than he had been. Not better in the abstract. More honest. More willing to pay the cost of honesty rather than the easier cost of distance and calculation. She thought that was worth something. She wasn't sure yet how much. "I'll think about it," she said again. He nodded and left her to the work, which was what she wanted and which he understood without being told. And she thought that this, the fact that he understood without being told, was one of the small true things that had accumulated over the weeks into something she hadn't expected to find in this building or with this man. She thought about it for 4 days. On the 4th day, she came into the office and put a single sheet of paper on Min-jae's desk, which was a list of conditions. Not long, 6 items, written in her handwriting, specific and clear. She put it down and stepped back. He read it without picking it up. "The third condition," he said, "non-negotiable. The third condition says that any investigation I ask you to conduct that you determine to be in conflict with the public interest, you can decline without explanation." "Yes." "That means I don't know in advance whether you'll take a job." "Correct." He looked at the paper. "That's not a workable structure for a... It's my structure," she said. "You set on my terms." He looked up at her. She looked back. "Agreed," he said. She picked up the paper and put it in her bag, because she kept her copies of things. "I want an office," she said, "not the archive room. You can have the office 2 doors down from the archive. I want a window." "It has a window." "Good." She left to set up her office. The window looked east over the part of the city that was not the glamorous part, the buildings that were not famous, the streets that were not photographed, the ordinary dense texture of a place where millions of people lived their complicated lives at close range. She stood at it for a few minutes before she started moving furniture and thought about what it meant to be here, in this place, doing this work, on these terms. It meant the 8 years were over. Not erased. Nothing erased anything. She had learned that the hard way, and she was done pretending otherwise. But over, in the sense of finished. The chapter of her life organized around finding the truth of what had happened was done because she had found it. The chapter organized around pure vengeance was done because she had decided, in a council room with her hip aching and the documents in front of 3 men who were reading them, that she was not going to become something she didn't want to be in the name of a feeling that was real, but that she refused to let define her entirely. What came next was different, not easier. She didn't think her life was going to be easier. She thought it was going to be complex in different ways, demanding in different ways. And she thought she was going to have to make hard choices regularly and live with the ones she made. And she thought she was going to have to keep deciding, actively and consciously, not to let the worst things that had happened to her be the measure of everything that came after. She thought she was up to that. She moved the desk to face the window. A month later, on a Saturday morning in New Jersey, Amara sat in her mother's kitchen with a cup of coffee that was actually hot, and Elena sat across from her with her gray hair and her thinness and her 61 years, and between them on the table was a photograph. It was the only photograph Amara had of the 3 of them, herself, her mother, and Jade, taken 2 months before the fire at a birthday party for someone she couldn't remember anymore. A party that had been ordinary in every way, the kind of occasion that felt important only in retrospect because it was the last ordinary occasion. They were laughing in the photograph. All 3 of them, caught in a moment of something someone had said that had been genuinely funny, genuinely caught off guard, the kind of laughter that arrived without announcement. Jade's laugh was too loud even in a photograph. You could see it. Elena looked at the photograph for a long time. "She would have been 25 this year," she said. "I know. I think about what she would have been like." Her voice was steady. "I've been thinking about it for 8 years and I still don't know. She was still becoming." "She was," Amara said. She was still in the middle of becoming. Her mother's hand moved across the table and covered hers, the same gesture as the dark room 3 weeks after everything happened, and Amara turned her hand over and held it. They sat with Jade for a while, with who she had been and who she might have become, and with the specific grief of not knowing, which was its own kind of grief, the one that didn't have an object to be resolved against but just sat in the space where a person should have been. Then Elena said, "This man, Min Jae." "Yes." "Tell me what he is." Amara looked at the photograph, at her sister laughing. "Complicated," she said. "You said that already." "Because it's the most accurate thing I have." Her mother watched her face. "Are you safe?" "Safer than I've been in 8 years." She paused. "Which isn't the same as safe, but it's more honest." "Do you trust him?" She thought about the specific construction of trust, not the wholesale trust of someone who had not been hurt, which she would probably never be able to do again, but the conditional trust of someone who had watched a person make choices over time and concluded that the pattern of those choices was worth something. "Enough," she said. "I trust him enough for what this is." "And what is this?" She looked at her mother, at the question she was actually asking, underneath the question she had asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to find out." Her mother looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the photograph. Then she looked at her coffee. "She would have had opinions about him," Elena said. "Loud ones," Amara said, defended with complete conviction. "Yes." Her mother's mouth moved into something that was almost a smile, the specific bittersweet shape of smiling at something that hurt and was also genuinely funny. "She would have made us both explain ourselves at length." "We would have deserved it," Amara said. "Yes," her mother said, "we would have." They sat in the morning kitchen with the coffee going warm between their hands, and the photograph on the table, and Jade in the room the way the dead are sometimes in rooms. Not as absence exactly, but as a presence that has changed shape, that is no longer embodied, but is still somehow in the texture of the air, in the specific way two people who love the same person hold their faces when they talk about her. It was not the ending that Amara had imagined for 8 years. She had imagined, in the organizing fantasy of vengeance, an ending that felt complete in a way she now understood endings did not feel. She had imagined justice as a door that closed, a weight that lifted, a moment after which things were simply and finally better. What she had instead was different. She had her mother's hand across a kitchen table. She had a window that looked east over an ordinary city. She had work that mattered, and conditions she had set herself. She had a grief that was not going away but had changed shape into something she could live around rather than something she was living under. She had the truth, which was complicated and not entirely satisfying and was nonetheless the truth, and which she had spent 8 years doing the work of finding. She had the photograph. She picked it up, looked at Jade, mid-laugh, 17 and still becoming. She did not put it back down on the table. She put it in her bag. She was taking it with her, which was not something she had done before. She had kept her research life and her grief life in separate containers, and she was going to stop doing that because the separating had been its own kind of damage. Jade was coming with her, to the office with the east window, to the Saturday mornings in New Jersey, to whatever came next. She finished her coffee. It was still warm, which was small and real and enough. Her mother walked her to the door. They stood in the doorway the way they had been standing in doorways lately, taking the moment slightly longer than was strictly necessary. And Amara thought about how long it had been since she allowed herself to take a moment longer than necessary, to stand in a door and let the moment be itself instead of the entry to the next thing. "Next Saturday," she said. "I'll make real coffee," her mother said. "The coffee this morning was fine." "It was not." Amara looked at her. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Her mother smiled. It reached her eyes, which were Jade's eyes in a different face, and Amara held that for a moment without flinching from it. "Next Saturday," Elena said. "Next Saturday." She walked to the car. Dong-hyun was not waiting for her. She had stopped using Min-jae's car after the second week, had gotten her own rental and then her own lease, had drawn that line herself because the lines she drew herself were the ones that kept her grounded. She had her own car parked at the curb, ordinary and unremarkable, and she got in and sat for a moment before starting it. The street was quiet in the late morning Saturday way. A neighbor was working in a yard 2 houses down. A kid was riding a bike on the sidewalk with the specific focused expression of someone who had recently learned how and was not yet casual about it. The ordinary, unperformed life of a street that didn't know anything significant had happened nearby. She started the car. She drove back toward the bridge, toward the city, toward the east-facing window, and the work that was waiting, and the complicated shape of what her life had become on the other side of 8 years of a singular purpose. She drove over the bridge. She did not look at the water, which she had always done before. The old checking, the old confirmation that the city was still there, still requiring her, still providing the structure of urgency that she had used for years to avoid sitting with anything too quietly. She looked at the road. She thought about nothing in particular. The radio played something she didn't know, a song with a tempo that matched the bridge's rhythm. She let it play. The city came up around her as she crossed into it, enormous and indifferent and full of its millions of people doing their Saturday things, living inside the buildings that people like Jade had wanted to design, moving through streets that nobody particularly noticed until they were gone. She found her parking space, got out, stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the morning air on her face and the city doing what it did, which was everything all at once in a way that asked nothing of you in particular except that you choose your own direction and move in it. She chose her direction. She moved. The building was where she'd left it. 14th floor, east-facing window. The work was on her desk. The photograph of her sister was in her bag. She put it on the desk. She looked at it, Jade laughing, 17, still becoming, and she sat down and she opened the work and she began.